So what you've seen with Putin, he's very concerned about his image. He will feel the need to respond. But what he can't do, he can't respond symmetrically, right? Because firstly, the Russian security services are not as capable as Ukrainian security services. Secondly, Ukraine doesn't have strategic bombers. It has fighters and it has light bombers like Su-25s, kind of combat support aircraft. So he really probably has to respond with some form of symbolic strike, and we'll probably see that hitting targets in Kyiv, I would have thought. Oh, it's definitely humiliating. The fact that the SBU could penetrate so deep into Russian territory. These aren't really retaliation strikes. This is just what Russia does. It's whether Ukraine had struck this airbase or whether it had not struck this airbase, Russia would still be launching airstrikes, still be launching drone strikes. They'd still be killing Ukrainian civilians. It's just part of their strategy. They want to attempt to degrade the civilian morale. And you're already seeing this is that there are massive traffic jams across Russia as the FSB is desperately searching through every HGV and van in Russia, seemingly, to make sure that there's no Ukrainian surprises waiting in the roofs. I think you'll also see dispersal of bombers to bases where they are slightly more, potentially more protected. But again, this attack wasn't really limited by geography. It wasn't a case that these aircraft were taking off from Ukraine, so actually dispersing the aircraft just all across Russia doesn't really do that much. I think you will see potentially drone jamming equipment being employed at these airfields. But then again, one of the reasons that the Ukrainians, I think, have been so open about how they carried this off is they're not going to try this again. So potentially the Russians will invest a lot in defending these air bases from another attack of this sort, only for the next Ukrainian attack to be completely different. It won't appear again because you generally, in regards to covert actions, you don't repeat the same trick twice, right? It's just like the Israelis are probably not going to try smuggling pages filled with C4 to Hezbollah again, because Hezbollah would probably, you would think, now be checking their supply chains pretty intently. Nuclear weapons aren't magic. You don't drop a nuclear weapon and all of a sudden you win the war. And historically, funnily enough, even if you look at the two occasions in which they were used in Japan in 1945, there was a faction of the Japanese army which tried to launch a coup against the emperor in order to keep fighting. So the idea that you just drop a nuclear bomb and then immediately the enemy loses the will to fight or suddenly becomes militarily defeated is just not true. There are, incredible downsides to this. Obviously, the Chinese are incredibly unhappy about nuclear threats. They absolutely do not want a nuclear war. It's the last thing that they signed up for. The Indians also, Modi has gone on record as saying nuclear weapons cannot be used. You would have issues with, obviously, if you use a nuclear weapon, you have radioactive fallout to a greater or lesser extent, depending on exactly what weapon is used and where it's detonated. But there are so many downsides, and there really aren't that many upsides, because it would galvanize international opinion against Russia in a way that I don't think we've seen, even at the start of the full-scale invasion, when international opinion was pretty much united against Russia. I think them using a nuclear weapon would become, they would become a pariah to an extent which I don't think the world has ever seen. I also think that in regards to, you might see a far more determined Western response. There have been, I have seen people saying that there were potential Western plans that if the Russians did use a nuclear weapon, there would be a response from Western powers that would include airstrikes against Russian forces inside Ukraine. That's not confirmed, but I think that was something that was potentially back-channeled to Moscow at one point. They're effectively psychological weapons. So the Oreshnik has almost zero military value when it's armed with conventional warheads. It's designed to have, nuclear warheads mounted on it. It's an incredibly expensive way of sending a message. And no, they're not going to roll them out, on a widespread basis, because they're just too expensive. In November, when it hit Dnipro, it basically did no damage. In fact, Russian military bloggers were complaining about the level of damage that it did, because it was very dramatic. And you're right, it's difficult to intercept. But yeah, in a military basis, it's relatively inaccurate because it was designed to carry nuclear weapons. You don't need to be particularly accurate if you've got a nuclear weapon, obviously, for obvious reasons. The amount of conventional warheads that it can carry is relatively low. So yeah, it's not a particularly effective weapon. It's a psychological weapon. It was designed to create hysterical headlines in the West. And that's unfortunately what happened. You're seeing the Russians push down towards Sumy. They're not going to try and take the city, but what they're probably going to do is get it within heavy MLRS and FPV range, and they'll probably do what they've been doing in Kherson, which is conduct terror strikes on civilians. In Kherson, it's regular. It's actually essentially a practice that they do. They call it the human safari, where they send FPV drones to kill civilians, essentially kill anything that moves, effectively trying to depopulate that city. So I have a fear that they will do that in Sumy, unfortunately, and in Kharkiv. So if you haven't been to Kharkiv, it's difficult to explain how big that city is. Like it's absolutely massive. It's very industrial. It's the kind of city that would be incredibly difficult to take, even for the Russian military on day one of the war. The Russians have been pretty much consistent from day one of this war to now. One of the only things that changes now that they say that they must own these four regions of Ukraine: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk in their entirety. They'd already claimed Crimea, but now they claim these oblasts in their entirety. And that includes two regional capitals, Kherson, Zaporizhia, which are not occupied, which are full of Ukrainians. And quite simply, the Ukrainian government is never going to agree, nor would the Ukrainian people agree, to vacate territory that is not occupied by the Russians. For the Ukrainians, they're never going to agree to this. The Russians aren't serious about peace. They know the Ukrainians aren't going to agree to this. What they're doing is they're trying to appear to Donald Trump like they are negotiating in relative good faith, but they aren't. I mean, I'd actually argue that Putin's relatively predictable. So if you see generally what Putin does is he makes extravagant threats, and you can trace this all the way back to the start of the full-scale invasion, where he was talking about if Western countries intervene, you'll face consequences like none in history. And effectively, he was threatening to use nuclear weapons, and he's made this threat, and other people around him have made this threat repeatedly throughout the full-scale invasion. They made similar threats before we gave HIMARS to Ukraine. They made similar threats before we gave F-16s. They made similar threats before we authorized the use of Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles to strike targets within Russia's internationally recognized borders. I think that's been the big mistake the West has made repeatedly when dealing with Putin, is to understand that he really responds to strength. He does not respond to weakness. And if you listen to his threats, take his threats seriously, you will just get more threats and you'll get more bad behavior, because again, he responds to strength. Obviously there are some threats, and there are some things that, we just wouldn't do. The West is not going to start directly bombing Russia, obviously. That's clear. Russia's not going to start directly bombing NATO countries, despite the fact, again, they've made these threats over and over again. So there are kind of like genuine red lines and genuine lines that we won't cross and Russia won't cross either.